All right, we are here again for another True Health Tuesdays. And, friends, I'm not a big fan of comedy the way that it's generally delivered today. But even those who are a fan of comedians, they say a
Comedy
great
the way that it's generally delivered today.
hang
But
on
even
just a minute.
those who are a fan of comedians, they say a comedy the way that it's generally delivered today.
Hang
But
on
even
just a minute.
those who are a fan of comedians, they say a comedy the way that it's generally delivered today. But even those
Ah, there we are. Let's try it again. Sorry about the background there. I had another tab open. I was saying that, you know, it's known that comedians, when they deliver a great joke can land terribly if the timing is off. In fact, just look at the last few seconds, right? When I came in and had some background noise of my own self, that was terrible timing. And when the timing is off, friends, I mean, the rest of your whatever it is that you're doing is impacted as well. And so today, you know me, I'm Charles Reynolds with Living Manna Church. And on today's True Health Tuesday, Dr. Roger Swelt will teach us one source and one hormone that determines your circadian rhythm, your body's timing. And I just think that if we all listen today, we're going to really be blessed and find out how to keep a good clock. Dr. Swelt, does that sound about right in terms of what you're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, exactly. It does. It's definitely what we're going to be talking about and more. So what we're going to talk about today is actually more than just that. It's talking about light in terms of uh, the light that comes into our eyes and the light that hits our skin. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. But light is actually very, very important. And a lot of times when we talk about health, the next word that comes out of our mouths is nutrition. And what it is that we put into our bodies is always seems to be at the top. But what I want to say today is it's if you want your car to go for more than 100,000, 200,000 miles, it's more than just putting the right gasoline into the engine. That's important. What's also important, though, is making sure that you change the oil, making sure that you are rotating the tires, making sure that you're changing the air filter. And you know where I'm going with this. There are other aspects to health that's more than just nutrition. Light, as it turns out, is really, really important in ways that we are just now beginning to understand. So it would be a waste if you followed if we knew exactly what it was that we had to eat and what not to eat, and we followed those exactly, and we were experts in that area, thinking that we were done, and completely ignored all of these other things, it would be a mistake. So I think what we ought to do is educate ourselves on some really low-lying fruit about light and when it is that what it is that we should be doing and how it affects your body. So let's get started with that. Light is more than just a beautiful day. Light is more than just seeing the colors of the rainbow or seeing a painting. Light is much, much more than that. In fact, the light that comes from the sun, as you can see here, here's a breakdown of that solar spectrum. And you can see here that only 39% of the energy that comes from the sun is in the visible spectrum. In other words, the majority of the energy that comes from the sun is, quote, light that we can't even see. Some of it is beyond violet, and we call that ultraviolet. And some of it is beyond the red. We call that infrared. In fact, the majority of the energy that comes from the sun is in the infrared spectrum. And we're going to talk about more about that as we talk. But one of the things that we need to do right off the bat is have some definition of terms. So we've already talked about what ultraviolet light is. We've already talked about what infrared light is. What I want to talk about now is something called a lux. And it's a definition of how bright something is, or the density of light. So if I were to take a candle and I were to hold it a meter, which is about 3 feet, from a 3 foot by 3 foot or meter squared piece of paper, the light density on that surface would be known as 1 lux. Okay. That's pretty dim. We're going to talk more about lux. So I want you to understand what that means as we move forward, because we're going to get into some very interesting research here. To further define lux, though, I want you to sort of look at this chart. If you were in a room in your house, let's say a family room, okay, or family or living room, the brightness in that room is about 50 lux, okay, as compared to going outside in full daylight, where it is almost 100,000 lux. I want you to immediately understand that the amount of light that we get outside of our homes is a tremendous difference, thousands of times more than we get inside of our homes. That's the first point that I want you to understand. It may not seem that way, but if you were to take a camera and adjust it for stuff inside the house and then take it outside, you'd notice that there is a huge difference in the amount of light. We as humans adjust to that light pretty quickly by changing the size of our pupils and accommodation and things in our eyes and the brain, which kind of ratchets down and is able to adjust those settings fairly quickly. But nevertheless, there is a huge difference. So if you want more light, better to go outside. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about light and how it interacts with the human body. Today, we're just going to limit ourselves to how light comes into the human eye and the effects of light on the human eye. You know, in a subsequent lecture, we're going to talk about how light affects skin. We'll talk about near infrared radiation. We'll talk about ultraviolet. But today, we're going to simply talk about light as it goes into the eye and affects changes throughout your entire body. Okay? So the first thing that you've got to understand is kind of what we were just alluding to earlier, which is that there is a rhythm in your body. There is something called a circadian rhythm. Circa means about. Okay, so it's nearly about, circa. And then adian means a day. So, and that's exactly what this is. It's a circadian rhythm is a rhythm that lasts about a day. But it's not precise. And so the body needs to always kind of ask other people what time it is. It needs to ask the sun, hey, what time is it? And your body kind of gets these cues from the sun that tells the body when it's day and when it's night. When it's bright out, it's daytime, according to the body. And when it's night, it's nighttime. It's time for sleep and all of those sorts of things. This is important because there's all of these processes that are occurring all throughout the whole human body that are very specifically and appropriately timed. Kind of like one of the instruments in this orchestra. There is a violin, there is a cello, there is a flute, an oboe, there's the timpani. All of these things, when they're performing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, have to be exactly in sync, and that is the reason why they have a conductor. Well, all of these processes that are going throughout the entire human body also have a conductor that's telling them when things need to happen. And that conductor is in the brain, of all places, and it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, you don't have to memorize that. We'll come back to it, but just remember that the master clock, the conductor of all these processes of the human body, is conducted by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, why would you need to have that? It's because in certain times of the day, you have to do one process, and another time of the day, you do a different type of process. And if those things are not in equilibrium with each other, then things are going to happen badly. Look, I had a friend that used to work at Disneyland, except he worked at night. He would go in and actually do maintenance. So you know that Disneyland is a very different place during the day than it is at night. During the day, Disneyland is a place where you can go on rides. It's a place where you can spend money at the concession stand. It's a place where you line up. It's a place where everything looks beautiful, where characters are going around. You can eat at places. During the nighttime, it's a very different place. There are people in there that are weeding. There are people in there that are doing maintenance. There are people that are all sorts of things that are timed specifically to happen at night. Imagine what would happen if the maintenance crew came in during the day when people are lining up for rides. That would be unacceptable. They're timed this way so that things happen in a appropriate way. Things happen at night so that things can happen normally during the day. And as complicated as Disneyland is, the human body is far more complex, so that processes happen at night so that processes in your body can happen during the day. Let's give you an example of what's happening here specifically. So here's an example. Here's a graph of the circadian rhythm. And as you can see here, your best coordination happens to be usually around 2:30 in the afternoon. Your fastest reaction times are at 3:30 in the afternoon. Your highest blood pressure is usually around 6:30 in the evening. Melatonin secretion usually comes on at around 9 o'clock at night. That's a very important hormone. We'll talk more about that. And your lowest body temperature is usually around 4:30 in the morning. So again, here's the circadian rhythm, and everything has a time. Everything has to happen at the right time. Did you know that insulin secretion, insulin sensitivity, in fact, is highest in the morning, which means that your insulin levels only have to rise up a small amount to take care of the calories that you're eating in the morning. This is another lecture that we'll have later, but it might be worthwhile understanding that having a calorie in the morning is not the same as having a calorie in the evening in terms of metabolic health. Very, very different. Nevertheless, the circadian rhythm has to run, and it's got to run on time. So just be aware that that is one of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So how extensive is the circadian rhythm, and how much does it actually regulate? Well, it regulates melatonin. And we know that melatonin is an extremely powerful antioxidant. It reduces cancer, cortisol production. It's an antioxidant. It helps with sleep regulation. But there's a whole bunch of other things that it regulates. There are peripheral clocks that have to be timed as well. Feeding and fasting is timed on the circadian rhythm. Things like leptin and ghrelin, these are the substances that tell you when you are satisfied with food or when you're hungry, okay? Body temperature, the pancreas and glucose metabolism, vasopressin, acetylcholine, cortisol, insulin, and the list goes on and on and on. All of these things are perfectly timed to happen at the right time of day. So it's important to understand this. So what happens when we disrupt the circadian rhythm? One of the ways of figuring out why the circadian rhythm is so important is to disrupt it and see what happens. So we've done this in rodents. And we have a bunch of models that we use called jet lag models, and they have long-term light dark shifts. And what do we see? What happens as a result of this? Reduced body temperature, increased fat production, reduced immune systems, tumor developments. All of these are results of when you disrupt the circadian rhythm. And when you force desynchronization in rodents, you get these perturbed hormonal homeostasis. That's scientific talk for basically your hormones go out of whack. Well, what about humans? We've seen, we don't do this on purpose to humans for very long. We sometimes do it for a couple of days in randomized controlled trials, but we can see it in people who naturally are doing this sort of stuff. And you can get unscheduled secretion of insulin, leptin. Leptin is a hormone that makes you feel satisfied. And if that doesn't happen at the right time, you might feel like, hey, I need to eat something. I want to eat some more. Norepinephrine is a very important hormone as well. And then circadian misalignment induced by sleep deprivation can cause increased markers of insulin resistance. That's diabetes and inflammation. And we know that inflammation can lead to cancers and things of that nature. So again, it's important that these things, just like it would be a bad idea to get the maintenance crew and the people that empty the cash registers into Disneyland during the day when they're trying to take care of guests, it's going to be a problem if you disrupt the circadian rhythm for a long period of time and don't get the benefits of things that are supposed to happen at the right time. So you can see here that this is important. So here's the thing that I really want you to understand. This looks complicated because you see a bunch of medical stuff on here, but really it's not. It's very simple. Here on the left-hand side, we see a light bulb symbolizing light. And there can be light generally that comes on in the day and a lack of light that happens at night. This light that it comes in goes to the back of the retina and stimulates predominantly here in the lower portion of the retina. And by the way, you should understand that objects in your superior visual field will hit the retina on the bottom, and objects in the lower visual field will hit the retina at the top. This is basically, you may remember this from high school science, is the image is flipped on the back of your retina. So we typically see that there are these ganglion cells. These are nerve cells on the retina at the back of your eye that pick up the light, and they're known as intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. I'll say that fast. Intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. When you hear me say that, that is simply the ganglion cells at the back of the retina that are getting stimulated from light. Now, when that happens, they project not in the back of the brain where we see vision. They go to a completely different portion of the brain. And you may remember where I'm talking about, because it's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Yes, it's that part of the brain where the conductor sits. So here is the conductor getting his cue from the outside. He gets to find out, is this day or is this night? And if there is light stimulating the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, the suprachiasmatic nucleus says, aha, we're having light. Therefore, it must be day. Therefore, we must do all the things that are associated with the day. And as soon as light ceases to stimulate the intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells, now no more input is coming to the suprachiasmatic nucleus from the retina. And the master clock, the conductor, now says, aha, we are getting no more light. Therefore, it must be night. It must be night. If there's no light, it must be night. And that's the key thing to understand, is that the suprachiasmatic nucleus will not think that it is night unless it is getting no light. Okay, that's important to understand. Now, in addition to that, when these neurons from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, from these neurons from the retina go to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, there's also a second stop that it goes to, and it's this thing called the pineal gland. This pineal gland is the producer of melatonin in the brain. And melatonin is a hormone that tells the body it's time to go to sleep. Okay? So again, let's review. If light comes into the eye, it's telling the suprachiasmatic nucleus it is daytime, do not secrete melatonin to the pineal gland. When there is no light coming into the eye, the suprachiasmatic nucleus says, aha, it's night, and it tells the pineal gland, go ahead and secrete the melatonin. Okay? And melatonin is an extremely powerful antioxidant, very beneficial hormone that secretes around the body. We'll talk more about that in a later lecture, but this is extremely important to understand, because what is happening here is the master clock in that circadian rhythm, suprachiasmatic nucleus, is trying to line up all of the processes that are occurring that are supposed to occur throughout the day. They're like the cruise director. The cruise director has the list of all of the events that are going to happen on the cruise and needs to make sure that everything is happening in the right order. And what it's trying to do is trying to line up all the things that are supposed to happen at night with when it's actually night, and line up all the things that are in the day to when it is actually day. Okay, that's important to do. And if you lived on a desert island with no electronics, I guarantee you, because when it's light, it's going to be day, and when it's night, it's going to be dark, you would be perfectly aligned. You would have no problem. It would be beautiful. Okay, here's the problem. The problem is when we try to trick our conductor about what time of day it actually is. And that's what's happening today in America and around the world, in westernized countries, more and more and more. And it's because of the invention of Thomas Edison's called the light bulb. And not just Thomas Edison, but also the smartphone. And not just the smartphone, but the computer and the light, and a whole host of things. Because see what happens here is not the circadian rhythm doesn't want to be fooled. Okay, imagine you're going along on a desert island. Okay, and what happens is you get picked up and rescued and brought to a nice country like this one, the United States. And now what happens is you spend your first night in a modern home and the lights are on. And now your eyes are seeing bright light at 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night or even 11 o'clock at night. Bright lights. Your circadian rhythm is going to say, it's been more than 24 hours since it was dark and it's still light. I must be off. I must be too early. I need to delay my clock. My clock is too early because I thought it should be nighttime, but I'm still seeing light. Therefore, I'm going to have to delay all the processes that I was going to have done until it's later, so that now when the lights go off at 12 o'clock, that's when night begins. And so not only do we shut down melatonin production, because melatonin production will never happen so long as light is coming into the eye. That's number one. Number two, the circadian rhythm is going to be prepared for the next day so that when there is light at night, it's not going to think it's night, it's going to think it's day. So check out what happens. This is important to understand, is this whole thing right here, this whole circadian rhythm, if you can imagine, gets shifted to the right. Now, if it gets shifted to the right, that means it's not going to be ready for sleep. It's not going to be ready for sleep until way into the night. Folks, what do we call that? We call that insomnia. You go to bed when it's nighttime, but you can't go to sleep. And it's because your circadian rhythm is delayed. But folks, it not only ends there, it's also in the morning time, because all of that stuff that should have happened overnight gets pushed over to the daytime. And so when your alarm goes off at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, your circadian rhythm is still well into sleep mode. And because of that, we've created an entire industry called Starbucks, because we're sleepy in the morning. We can't get up. And so what do we have to do? We have to drink coffee to wake up. So we have insomnia in the evening, and we have Starbucks in the morning, right? We have hypersomnia. It's called sleep inertia. We have these funny names in science for these things. But that's exactly what's going on. And it's all because we've delayed our circadian rhythm. So what do we need to do? Here's what we need to remember. Light after sunset tends to delay your circadian rhythm by suppressing melatonin production in the pineal gland, and this causes your body to delay sleep onset. Guess what, folks? If you do exactly the same thing, expose your eyes to bright light, but if you do it in the morning, here's the good news. If you do it in the morning time when you get up, it has exactly the opposite effect. Early light, when you wake up, tends to advance your circadian rhythm, but it requires a little bit more intensity. And that's because those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in the retina are not as sensitive in the morning. So you really got to blast them. And what's the best way to blast them with light? Inside your house or outside your house? Outside your house. Remember, it's thousands of times more light outside your house. So that is the key here, is that instead of doing stuff at night on our computers, let's put it aside, go to bed early, and pick it up early in the morning. Number one, your brain is better rested. You're probably going to be more efficient, and you're going to get stuff done faster. So that's an easy thing that you can do to do it. So it's important to understand that about how the master clock is spent. So the consequences of bad timing. What happens if you don't do this? Well, there's a number of things that can happen in terms of bad timing. As it says here, the causation of which circadian rhythms predisposes individuals to developing mood disorders, causation in which the manifestation of mood disorders leads to circadian disruption, or the absence of causation in which the association between circadian disruption and mood disorders reflects commonality in underlying physiological processes. Basically, what happens here is there's a lot of bad mood issues that can happen or are associated with not exposing your eyes to bright lights. So I've talked to you already about light coming into the eye, hitting the intrinsic photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, and going right through this red line to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the clock. But there is another place in the body that this goes, and it's the blue line here. And if you want to be scientific and know how to say this stuff and impress your friends, tell them it's going to the perihabenular nucleus. Now, the perihabenular nucleus is a portion in the brain that deals with mood. This is important, folks, because 5% of the world's population have something called SAD, seasonal affective disorder. It affects them about 40% of the year, 5% of the population, females more than males. Now, if you look at this, they have done over 173 studies. When you look at all those studies, what do they find? They find that if you expose these people with seasonal affective disorder, and typically these are people that live in countries where they don't get a lot of sunlight. So northern hemisphere in the wintertime, southern hemisphere in the summertime, or I should say in the wintertime, northern hemisphere in December, January, southern hemisphere in June, July. If you expose these people's eyes to bright light in the morning, what happens? Their depression goes away. And it's because you're stimulating their photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, and it's stimulating the perihabenular nucleus. Really important to understand that. So in people, here's another experiment that they did where they took a light in the room where they're sleeping. And what they did was they have this light slowly come on at 5 or 6 in the morning and then get brighter and brighter and brighter until the bright light lights up the whole room and they wake up. That bright light actually, folks, can penetrate through closed eyelids and actually can stimulate these retinal ganglion cells to not only entrain their circadian rhythm so that it's at the right time of day, but also stimulate the perihabenular nucleus, which is associated with mood. And what did they find? They found that the size effect was that this reduced depression. Not only did it reduce depression, folks, but it also improved cognition. That's the medical term for thinking. It was easier for people to think clearly when they got early morning light exposure. So that's amazing. What about this? What about bipolar depression? This was a study that was done looking at bipolar depression. What did they find? 46 subjects, 23 in each group. When they started to get up to about an hour per day of bright light, this was about 7,000 lux. Notice the green arrow here shot up. What was this? This was remission. People with bipolar disease in remission shot up to nearly 70% in those that had early morning light exposure versus 20% in those that did not. So this is really amazing. I mean, this is not like a few percentage points. This has a huge impact on our daily lives. Here's another study that was done called The Effects of Artificial Dawn on Subjective Ratings of Sleep Inertia. Sleep inertia basically is where you feel sleepy when you get up in the morning. And dim light melatonin onset. This is how much melatonin comes on when you go to sleep at night. So when you exposed your eyes to bright light in the morning, not only did it reduce sleep inertia, in other words, you felt more awake in the morning, it also allowed more melatonin production at night so that you could fall asleep. There was a significant reduction in sleep inertia and in the 250 versus the 50 lux. Here's another one, effects of dawn stimulation, of artificial dawn. So this is, again, this light that's lighting up in the morning in your room, and morning blue light, which is good, on daytime cognitive performance. What did they find? That dawn simulating light improves subject feeling, mood, and cognitive performance as compared to the other dim light or blue light that was really, really at a placebo low level. So again, if you want to improve how you think, if you want to improve how you feel in the morning when you get up, if you want to be able to fall asleep nicely when you go to bed, if you want to have melatonin being secreted at night that is an antioxidant and is protecting you from all sorts of diseases and infections and cancers, my recommendation would be to specifically expose your eyes to bright light in the morning, preferably outside, and avoid stimulating your retina with bright light after 9 o'clock at night. I think that's really key in terms of that. Here's another, so let's talk about the hypothalamic axis. Cortisol. So cortisol secretion always comes on in the morning, higher in the morning, and melatonin is also higher at night. Melatonin is like the moon. It governs the night, and cortisol is like the sun. It governs the day. Okay. This timing is influenced by the circadian rhythm. So bright light is a strong stimulus for adrenal production of cortisol. You need that in the morning. Okay. Melatonin, on the other hand, does not want strong light. It wants darkness. And so when you expose your eyes to bright light at night, you say goodbye to melatonin. Now, you're probably wondering, well, couldn't I just take melatonin as a supplement? Unfortunately, it doesn't work very well. People get headaches with it. Do you really know what you're getting when you order melatonin as a supplement? Nobody's really looking at it. It's not regulated by the FDA. It's a nutraceutical. So no one's really looking at it. Here's the point, is that even with your eyelids closed, if light gets through your eyelids, it can stimulate the back of your retina enough to shut down melatonin production. Okay. We talked about that. What about at night? Okay, so you come home at night and you say, you know what? I need to read. I need to read to go to sleep. And there's this great book on my Kindle or my e-reader that's backlit. Is that going to be a problem? Well, check this out. They did a study where they looked at the amount of luminance from an e-reader versus just opening up a regular paper book that's illuminated with a dim light. And this is what they found. The amount of light hitting your retina is measured in the spectrum by this line here on the top that I'm showing you. Whereas that's the e-reader. Okay, that's how much light is coming into your eyes from the e-reader. At the bottom here, these little bumps, that's coming from the book that's illuminated by the low lit lamp. Much less, much less. And so what's the consequence of this? Well, for those people that use the e-reader here on the right, it took them statistically significantly more time to fall asleep. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise to you, because more light going into the eye is going to shut down melatonin. And if you don't have melatonin, you're not going to go to sleep. All right. Now, okay, so light affects the brain. Does it affect anything else? Unfortunately, folks, a lot of evidence for cancers when people are not getting enough sleep at night. There's some data that shows in women who are working night shifts and they get breast cancer, if they don't get enough sleep, that can actually be a contributor to recurrence of breast cancer. There's some data on that. You can see here, ocular input for human melatonin regulation, relevance to breast cancer. Under highly controlled exposure circumstances, less than 1 lux of monochromatic light elicited a significant suppression of nocturnal melatonin. This is really, really dim. So you need it to be dark. You need your eyes to be closed. And for those of you who are night shift workers, this is really important for you to understand, is you can't go around doing night shift some of the days of the week and then living your life as a diurnal animal the other half, where you wake up in the day and go to sleep at night. It doesn't work. Your circadian rhythm doesn't adjust that quickly. You've got to basically, if you are a night shift worker, first of all, bless your heart, because you're doing an important work. And you're really helpful, because if we didn't have night shift workers, for instance, nurses in the hospital, our patients would die. So it's important that you're doing it. But what I would say is that you are waking up in the morning at 5 p.m. and you're going into work at 7 p.m. and you're working that whole night. You should have bright light. It should not be dim. You should have bright light. It's your daytime. And then when you go home at 7 o'clock in the morning, you go right to bed. And you need to make sure that your bedroom is completely blacked out, that you have foil on the windows, that there's no light coming in, and you sleep for your 8 hours, because that's when you are getting melatonin. You are essentially living the same life as somebody on the other side of the planet, except you're living it here. So you've got to do that even on days that you have off. Okay, that's how you're going to get the benefit of melatonin. If you are some days doing night shift and then other days living with the rest of your family, your circadian rhythm is confused. You're trying to sleep when your body is not ready for it. You're going to be chronically sleep deprived. So that's really how you ought to attack this situation. All right, let's move on to this question. Melatonin and cancer risk. Does light at night compromise physiological cancer protection by lowering serum melatonin levels? Here's another one. Why the incidence of cancer is increasing. The role of light pollution. These are all questions that are being raised, and there is data that supports that this is a potential situation. So, question, what should I do in the morning? Here's the long answer. Sunlight before 9 o'clock, 30 seconds to 30 minutes. Of course, the brighter the light is, the less time you have to be in it. So if you go outside, that's 100,000 lux. You only have to be out there for a few minutes to get that benefit. I would not wear sunglasses because you want as much stimulation as possible. Would not get it through windows or windshields because you're blocking against some of that lux. It takes 7 to 50 times longer than if you're inside. I mean, if you are inside. And you're not going to get enough to stimulate the cortisol pulse on time. Okay. Or if the situation is that you're getting up in the morning and you live in a part of the world where the sun is not yet up, then I would invest in getting a simple $20 to $30 lamp called a SAD lamp or SAD lamp. That's 10,000 lux. Use it for 20 to 30 minutes a day in the morning. Hold it about 11 to 15 inches from your head and get that light into your eyes to get your circadian rhythm in sync, stimulate that perihabenular nucleus, which is for mood, and to make sure that your circadian rhythm is on sync. Okay, so that's important to do. What should you do in the evening? After 9 o'clock, any light that's on that you don't need on, shut it off. In fact, any overhead lamp really needs to be shut off. Remember what we said about the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. They're on the bottom of your eye, which means they're particularly sensitive to light overhead. If you want to have like light around the bottom of your walls, like those night lights after 9 o'clock, that might be better. It might be better, but really the best thing to do is to shut lights off at 9 o'clock at night. This turning of night into day can be a pretty bad habit, especially for your circadian rhythm. All right, let's go on. So again, let's get more specific. What should you do in the evening? Macs, iPhones, put them into night shift mode if you have to use them. PCs, turn them off. Look, it's better if I understand that we live in a modern society and we have to use things. Sometimes you just can't get away from it. Limit it. It's better to limit it than to not do any limitation at all. And if you can turn it off, turn it off. Certainly do any work that you can possibly do in the morning rather than at night. And then, so that basically sums up how light interacts with us in our eyes and what it does. What we'll talk about the next time I'm on is we're going to talk about how light affects the body, and that's really mind-blowing about how the infrared radiation can actually penetrate through the skin, even through your skull, and get into your brain and actually cause effects in your brain. I think that's going to be an interesting discussion that we talk about. But for now, what are the take-home points? The take-home point is that after 9 o'clock, limit light exposure. Before 9 o'clock in the morning, have as much light exposure as possible. And I think, unfortunately, what we're doing in our society is the opposite of that. And we need to do more of this. So with that, I'm available for any kind of questions. We can look here in the chat as well.
Yeah, Dr. Schwald, there are several questions. Thank you again for this really a dynamite presentation because of how important this subject is. And you're right, it is low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of things that we're seeing and learning that we can do to positively impact the outcome of so many health outcomes just when it comes to how we operate in our lives and how we utilize light and when. You know, just before I mention the first question here, I wanted to say that when you mentioned that this is where my mind went when you said the circadian rhythm has to run and it has to run on time. it reminded me of the old timing belts. And the timing belt in a car basically open and closes the valves in your engine's camshaft. And
Yeah.
it does it at just the right time so that the car has smooth operation. And there's so many things that happen in a car, just like your body, so many processes and functions.
Right.
And it's really dependent largely on that timing belt. And so, you have the camshaft that opens and closes valves. There's usually at least two valves, and one at the top of one cylinder brings in the combustion and all the other gases and so forth, pulls that combustible air in, and then the other valve opens to expel the exhaust gases
Right.
that are left over from the combustion. And so the timing is crucial to keep you safe and keep that engine humming along, as well as the other parts of the car, just like the
Yeah.
circadian rhythm.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's there's a whole science. We haven't even scratched the surface here. We actually will have a lecture coming up on eating, as we kind of alluded to. There are certain times of the day that are better for eating than other times, and we'll
Wow.
talk about why that's important.
All right. Well, Dr. Swart, we do have several questions. Like I said, Gigi's question is it true that certain mattresses can be better or helpful for regulating circadian rhythm?
Well, it all sort of depends on what's comfortable for you. So some people I know people that like to have firm mattresses, very firm. They like it to be firm. Other people if they had a firm mattress, they'd never be able to fall asleep. Generally, you want to have something that is comfortable. You also want to have, the temperature generally cooler at night. It's easier to fall asleep when the temperature is cooler. That's because of your circadian rhythm. You obviously don't want to have a lot of noises. You want to have as little light as possible. But in terms of mattresses, the only other thing I could tell you is that if you are someone who has obstructive sleep apnea, where basically the tongue falls back in the back of your throat, lifting the mattress up or elevating the head of the mattress, if you have that sort of thing, may be also beneficial. Of course, if you have sleep apnea, you should seek treatment and get CPAP treatment or dental device or what have you, some sort of treatment for that, because you're not going to get good sleep unless you get that sleep apnea treated.
Dr. Swelt, there's these stickers now that they put over the mouth. Have you seen those? They're not breathing strips exactly, but they're supposed to keep the mouth closed and encourage nasal breathing. Have you seen those? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, they've looked at that. One of the things is that whenever you open your mouth at night, your tongue tends to fall back more easily, and therefore make it worse. I always kind of shy away from taping mouths closed. That just as a pulmonologist, it seems to me a little bit like you don't want to have your mouth closed when you're sleeping. Although I understand what their thoughts are, I think a better way of treating sleep apnea, if that's what they're trying to treat, is some of the more confirmed methods that have been tested, like CPAP, dental devices, things of that nature.
Yep, and I'm not sure that they're trying to treat any serious issue. I think from what I've seen, that it's just for people who may keep their mouths open a little bit. But yeah, definitely want to seek something a little more tested if you do have sleep apnea or something of that nature. So the next question is from Janelle, and she asks, do light boxes help with seasonal affective disorder? And there's another. Oh, actually, Janelle did say you answered this question for her.
Yeah.
Later on in the presentation. So she said later on that I have a light box and wanted to know if they actually are beneficial, and you did cover that.
Yeah, they are. In fact, they're known as SAD boxes, SAD, seasonal affective disorder boxes. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. And so, one of the things that I like to see in the chat is that people are learning and being benefited. Pauline says that she's worked nights for years, and she realizes after this presentation that it's time for a change. And we do appreciate, as Dr. Swelt mentioned earlier, the work that you do, Pauline. But yes, we need to take care of ourselves as well. And then there's something else that was mentioned, Dr. Schwelt, that people have racing thoughts. It becomes very difficult to manage at nighttime. And one of the suggestions in the chat was taking a notebook and writing your thoughts down. And that was something that helped this person out. Is that something that you've seen in the evidence, or?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I recommend that to my patients too. So that's a very good piece of advice. Is it kind of allows your brain to put it to rest, knowing that you're not going to forget it, and there's going to be a list tomorrow that you're going to pick up, and you're just putting it aside for now. When you don't do that, you sort of hold on to it because if you're afraid that if you're going to let it go, then you forget about doing it or you're putting it away. This gives your brain permission to let it go and to get that sleep.
Okay, another simple action that we can take to help us to get to sleep. Now, here's an interesting one from Deborah, and she says that she hates, she said hates sleeping in total darkness. She's wondering why that is. Later on in the presentation, she did say, she recognizes the importance of keeping nighttime. So she's going to work on that. And we've got people praying as well for you, Deborah, in our prayer team to help you to do that. But Dr. Schwelt, anything that you can say regarding people who, I don't know if you've run across this before, but that don't like darkness, total darkness at night?
One of the things that you could do is put it on a timer so that you fall asleep with the light on, and then the light just turns off by itself. So you don't know when that turns off. It may, I'm not saying that this happens in everyone, but there are fairs and things where you like to see light. It gives you a little bit more comfort to know that, and then you sort of fall asleep. But it's not an uncommon problem, but it's not something we see every day.
Got it. Okay. And Pauline again realizes that her circadian rhythm is messed up. So some thoughts that she's taken away to improve that today, and she's happy and excited about starting some new actions to help her circadian rhythm. Here's an interesting one that in this question says, this was around taking caffeine in from Starbucks. And this person no longer does that necessarily, but they do use decaffeinated, I guess it's coffee, with oat milk. What do you think about that in terms of some of these decaffeinated drinks, whether they be Starbucks or for some other places? Is that getting us in the clear, or still some challenges with those drinks?
Well, it depends on exactly what their contents are. The big issue, of course, is caffeine. Caffeine is a substance that it tricks your body into believing that you're not as tired as you actually are. There's a substance that builds up during the day as you are awake for longer and longer called adenosine. And adenosine has a signal, tells your body as it starts to build up that there's a drive to fall asleep. What caffeine does is simply effectively drops that adenosine level and makes you feel more awake than you actually are. So that's one of the things that caffeine does. Obviously, caffeine is not in decaf, but there may be other issues with those drinks depending on what's in them, sugar and all sorts of things.
Yeah, yep, that's true. A lot of times they'll have some, I know, a lot of extra sugar in them, or sugar substitutes, which really aren't very great for our health either. So another question comes in about blue light blocking glasses. Are they effective, and can we use those at night? I guess if we're watching something or doing some work on our computers and things like that.
Yeah, so blue blocking glasses or watching screens that have blue blockers in them, all of those are good at taking out the most egregious wavelength that stimulates the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells and shuts down melatonin, but it's not as good as no light. So, the best thing would be no light. The next best thing would be blue blocker glasses, or, night TV or night algorithms on your screen. And then the thing at the bottom, of course, would be not wearing anything and still watching those things. So the best thing would be no light at all.
Yeah, I did see the slide where you showed how low the light should be, and it was extremely low for us to really get the health benefits that we're searching for. So dark is best. Okay, I think there's one more question that I see here. We've talked about the blue light. Let's see, what was the last one? Oh, does candlelight come was the other question. Does candlelight count, rather? So I guess they're asking at nighttime, if we have candlelight, does that affect us the same way as any other light?
Okay, so the things that are the worst offenders at night would be bluish light and light that is high up, and bright light. Candles have, basically candles are the opposite of all of that. They typically are lower, they're more reddish, and they are in a more mild, they're not as bright, right? So while candlelight is not the same as no light, which would be the best, candlelight is probably the least offensive light to the eye. And if you think about that, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, 100 years ago or more, human populations, when they wanted lights at night, they gathered around a kerosene lamp or fire, and it was usually low down, and it was giving off near infrared radiation. It was typically in the reddish form. So you can see there already that our bodies are better designed to be tolerating that type of light at night than it would be these high overhead LED lights that are giving us kind of a bluish light type of tinge. So yeah, so a candlelight would probably be better. But, of course, candlelight has its own problems in that you've got the risk of fire. So you have to be careful.
Yeah. Okay, good. There is another question here. Patrice says, what about those little night lights and outlets? Still going to be the same thing, right, Dr. Swell?
Yeah, and I would just add there that there is some recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Their concern is that these night lights that are left on in child rooms at night. Remember, these lights can penetrate through the retina, penetrate through the eyelids, and get into the retina. And are you exposing these children to chronically low melatonin levels? And risk not recurrence, but the occurrence of leukemia, lymphomas. There's been some data on that. I don't think it's as conclusive as we'd like it to be, but from my standpoint, I would prefer, if it were my kids, to have the rooms as dark as possible.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Schwelt, thanks so much for joining us here again today. This is the last question that we are going to tend to, but do keep us on your speed dial. We'll be here next week with Living Manna. You can also follow us on Instagram at My Living Manna if you're looking for more health information like you've gotten today. Dr. Schwelt, what did you have in mind for the next presentation, just so that we can whet the appetites a little bit?
Yeah, we're going to talk about how light, specifically near infrared light from the sun, penetrates deeply into the body and actually affects the mitochondria and produces 20 times more melatonin locally there than does the pineal gland. And this is going to be mind-blowing.
Okay. Well, don't miss that, friends. Remember True Health Tuesdays. We're here every Tuesday. And also, I'd like to invite you to come back and see us on Sabbath, that's Saturday mornings at 8:30 a.m. or 8:30 a.m. That's Pacific time, 10:30 Central. And we'll have some God-fearing messages for you then if you're interested in that. Otherwise, we'll see you next Tuesday for True Health Tuesday. For Dr. Roger Schwelt, I'm Charles Reynolds, and this has been True Health Tuesday. Goodbye, everyone.